Edric ran a small repair shop at the edge of town, quiet and worn like the bags he fixed. He never turned away a broken thing, leather, canvas, buckle, or strap. He believed everything deserved to be mended, no questions asked. The shop had no grand sign above the door, only a small painted board that read Edric's Repairs in letters that had faded to a humble brown over the years. The building itself leaned slightly to the left, as though it had grown tired somewhere around its 30th year and decided slouching was acceptable. The window glass was old and wavy, the kind that made the outside world look like it was seen through gently moving water. Inside, the smell was magnificent, a deep, rich mixture of leather and linseed oil, beeswax and metal polish, a old canvas, and something faintly herbal from the conditioning creams he mixed himself. Every surface held purpose. Shelves lined 3 walls from floor to ceiling, stacked with spools of thread in every weight and color imaginable, jars of brass and silver hardware, rolls of leather in varying thickness, bundles of canvas and waxed cloth, tools hanging from hooks in the precise order Edric had decided upon 20 years ago and never once reconsidered. His workbench ran the full length of the back wall, scarred and stained and absolutely perfect in his estimation. He had apprenticed under an old bag maker at 14, inherited the shop at 30, and had not once in all the years between considered doing anything else with his hands or his life. My people came to him with things they loved and feared losing: a grandmother's traveling trunk, a child's first school bag, a soldier's worn field pack. They came embarrassed sometimes, apologetic, as though a broken buckle were a personal failing. Edric always received them the same way, without judgment, without impatience, with the quiet and steady attention of a man who understood that the value of a thing was rarely visible in its condition. Edric took it, hummed to himself, and Edric took it, hummed to himself, and simply said, "Come back in 2 days." The morning had been slow and colorless, the kind that settled over Velmore like a damp cloth, muffling sound and dulling light in equal measure. Edric had been at his bench since dawn, resoling the bottom of a merchant's travel bag, when the bell above his door gave its familiar small ring. He looked up. The figure in his doorway was short, remarkably so, draped entirely in a dark traveling cloak several sizes too large. The hood was pulled so far forward that no face was visible beneath it, only a deep shadow that seemed to shift and breathe on its own. The cloak hem dragged along his floorboards. The sleeves swallowed whatever arms existed inside them completely. It shuffled forward in small, careful steps, the way a creature moves when it is uncertain whether the ground beneath it is safe. Edric set down his tools and waited. He had learned long ago that rushing a nervous customer helped no one. The figure stopped at the counter. A pause stretched between them, long and delicate as pulled thread. Then, slowly, 2 small hands emerged from the oversized sleeves, narrow and dark-scaled, tipped with short curved claws that caught the shop's warm lamplight in brief gleams. They lifted a satchel from beneath the cloak and placed it on the counter with extraordinary care, as though the act of letting go of it required real courage. Then the hands withdrew. The figure said nothing. In 2 places, the stitching had unraveled in 2 places. The stitching had unraveled along the entire left seam, and the brass clasp had been fused nearly shut by tremendous heat. He noticed the tail beneath the cloak and the faint smoke curling from the hood. He said nothing about either, just picked up his needle and got to work. Whatever the child was, the bag still needed fixing. That was enough for him. He had noticed both things the moment the small figure stepped through his door. The tail had appeared briefly when the cloak shifted during the figure's careful shuffle toward the counter. Dark-scaled, tapered, curling slightly at the tip, the way a cat's might when its owner was trying very hard to appear calm. It had disappeared back beneath the hem almost immediately, as though its owner had realized the exposure and corrected it with quiet urgency. Edric had glanced at it for exactly 1 second, and then returned his eyes to the counter. The smoke was subtler. It rose in the thinnest possible thread from somewhere deep within the hood, barely visible, more suggestion than substance, the kind of thing a person would miss entirely if they weren't paying the particular quality of attention that Edric paid to everything that entered his shop. It carried a faint scent, mineral and warm, like stone left long in the sun. He had noted both. He had filed them away. He had said absolutely nothing. It was not that he was unaware of what they meant. Edric was a well-read man who had lived 61 years in a world where dragons existed in the mountains beyond the valley, where their young were spoken of in the market occasionally in hushed and uncertain tones. He understood perfectly well what clawed hands and a smoking hood suggested about the nature of his small customer. It simply did not change anything. He had a scorched satchel on his workbench, a broken clasp, and unraveled seams demanding his attention. He had fireproof thread to select and leather panels to cut and a brass clasp to carefully reshape without cracking the metal further. He had a job to do, and a promise of 2 days made to a child who had walked in. When the figure returned, the satchel sat waiting, restitched, reinforced, and polished clean. Edric waived the fee because the job had taken longer than he'd promised. The small figure clutched the repaired bag to its chest and stood very, very still. 2 days passed, and on the morning of the 3rd, the bell above the door rang at almost exactly the same hour as before. Edric was already at his bench. The satchel sat on the counter where he had placed it first thing that morning, positioned squarely in the center with the clasp facing forward, the way he always presented finished work, with a small dignity, as though the bag itself deserved to be found in a good posture. He had spent considerably more than 2 days' worth of effort on it. And the scorched panels had been carefully cut away and replaced with new leather treated specifically for high heat, sourced from a small supplier he used for smithing equipment and fireproof travel gear. The seams had been restitched twice, once for structure, once for reinforcement, using a waxed fireproof thread that would hold against temperatures no ordinary bag had any business surviving. The brass clasp had taken him the better part of an entire evening alone, slowly and carefully reshaping the fused metal with fine tools until it clicked open and shut with a clean, satisfying snap. He had conditioned the leather afterward, polished the hardware, and reinforced the strap where the original maker had, in his opinion, been somewhat optimistic about the stitching required. It was, by any honest measure, a finer bag than it had been before it was damaged. The small cloaked figure approached the counter and stopped. For a long moment it simply looked at the satchel, at the neat seams, the gleaming clasp, the careful work done to something it had perhaps believed was beyond saving. Edric slid it gently across the counter. "No charge," he said simply. "Took longer than I quoted. That's my rule." The child came back the next morning with another broken bag, and then again the day after. A fraying pouch, a missing buckle, a zipper that had long surrendered its will to close. Edric repaired each one carefully and never once made the child feel strange for returning. The fraying pouch arrived first, a small drawstring bag made of rough canvas, the cord so worn through at the neck that it snapped entirely when Edric tested its strength with 2 gentle fingers. The seam along the base had separated for nearly half its length, and the fabric itself was stiff and discolored in patches, as though it had been stuffed hastily with something very warm on more than one occasion. He replaced the drawstring with a braided fireproof cord, restitched the base seam with double reinforcement, and treated the canvas with a conditioning solution that softened it back to something comfortable. It was ready by afternoon. The next morning the figure returned for the pouch and left a battered leather messenger bag in its place. The buckle was gone entirely. Not broken, simply absent, as though it had parted ways with the bag under circumstances neither party wished to revisit. The strap had been knotted together in two places to compensate, the knots tight and careful in the way that suggested someone had thought hard about the problem and solved it as best they could with what was available. Edric unknotted the strap, spliced and re-stitched it cleanly, and fitted a new brass buckle from his supply that was heavier and sturdier than the original had likely ever been. The zipper came after that. It was an old metal one on a small travel bag. The pull tab snapped off, the teeth misaligned along one stubborn stretch near the middle that caused the whole mechanism to jam and shudder uselessly. Edric replaced the pull tab, realigned the teeth with a careful tool he kept specifically for this purpose, and ran the zipper back and forth 17 times until it moved. He began to notice the bags were all small, scorched from the inside, gripped too hard by claws. Some had been rained on so long the leather had warped, hinting at nights spent outdoors alone. He said nothing. He simply used better materials each time and reinforced every weak point. It was the kind of noticing that crept up slowly, detail by detail, the way a full picture reveals itself only after enough pieces have assembled quietly in the background of a patient mind. The scorching was the first thing that confirmed a pattern. Every bag carried it in some form, not surface burns from an external flame, but heat damage that originated from within, blooming outward through the lining and into the leather, like a secret that had grown too large to contain. The burns were irregular, emotional almost. He concentrated in the areas a small body would press closest to: the base, the sides, the inner corners where something curled and warm might rest during a frightened or restless night. The claw marks told their own quiet story. They appeared on every handle, every strap, every surface. A small hand had gripped repeatedly and with great feeling. Not destructive marks, not the kind made in anger or play, but the deep-pressed impressions of claws holding on through something difficult. Holding on the way a child holds the hand of someone they are afraid to lose, or the way a small creature grips the only thing it owns when everything else feels uncertain. And then there was the rain damage. Leather warped by prolonged wet exposure had a particular look that Edric knew well. A stiffness along the edges. A ghostly tide line where water had soaked in and dried and soaked again over many hours, sometimes many nights. The bags that came to him carried this damage not as accident but as pattern, the kind that spoke of regular exposure, of sleeping somewhere the weather reached without obstruction, of mornings that began damp and cold without a... One morning, 3 small cloaked figures stood in a row just inside his doorway. Each held a damaged bag like an offering, each watching him with careful, cautious eyes. Edric pulled out 3 paper tags and asked, very simply, for their names. He had just settled onto his stool and wrapped his hands around his morning tea when the bell rang. He looked up expecting one small, cloaked figure, the way he always did now, had grown accustomed to it, had come to consider that particular bell ring as simply the first proper moment of his working day. Instead, he found 3 of them standing in the doorway, arranged in a loose and uncertain row, the tallest on the left, the roundest in the middle, and the smallest on the right barely visible beneath a hood so oversized it swallowed the top half of its wearer entirely. And they were all very still, the stillness of creatures who had rehearsed this moment and were now discovering that the actual experience of it was considerably more nerve-wracking than the rehearsal. Each one held a bag. The tallest held a singed leather satchel with a buckle hanging by a single rivet. The middle one clutched a small beaded purse with a broken drawstring and a clasp that had been bent at a painful angle. The smallest one held up a canvas lunch bag with a cracked handle using both hands, lifting it slightly as though presenting it formally, which Edric found quietly and completely charming. Nobody spoke. The 6 careful eyes, Ember bright and watchful beneath their respective hoods, tracked his every movement with the focused attention of small beings accustomed to reading situations very quickly for signs of whether they were welcome or not. Edric set down his tea unhurriedly. He reached beneath the counter and produced 3 paper tags and a length of thin twine, his standard system for keeping track of multiple jobs from the same visit. He smoothed all 3 tags flat on the counter with his palm. Then he looked up at them. The tallest one whispered Smolder, the rounder one murmured Cinders, the smallest signed Ash. Edric wrote each name on a tag, tied one to each bag, and promised all 3 by morning. He kept his word. He always did, every single time, without fail. The name came from the tallest one first. It arrived barely above a whisper, cautious and small, as though the act of offering a name to a stranger required more bravery than anything else attempted that morning. Smolder. Just the one word, spoken with the careful stillness of someone who had learned to give very little away until they understood whether it was safe to give more. Edric wrote it on the first tag in his clean, unhurried hand and tied it to the singed leather satchel without comment or ceremony. And the middle one watched this happen, watched the name be received without reaction, written down with respect, attached to the bag with the same quiet care given to everything in this shop, and something in the round little shoulders settled by a fraction. Cinders, she murmured, softer than a whisper, more breath than sound. Edric wrote it down, tied it on, looked at the smallest one. The tiny figure beneath the oversized hood did not speak. Instead, one small clawed hand emerged, pointed at its own chest once, and then made a slow, deliberate gesture, fingers spreading gently outward like something dispersing on the wind. Ash. The meaning was perfectly clear. Edric wrote Ash on the 3rd tag with the same careful hand he had used for the other 2, though and tied it to the canvas lunch bag the small one was still holding up with both hands. He took the bag gently so the child would not have to keep holding it aloft. All 3 by morning, he said, looking at each of them in turn. Come when the shop opens. Then he turned to his workbench and began. He worked through the afternoon and into the evening without particular hurry, but without pause either, moving between all 3 bags. He placed a bowl of cinnamon candies on the counter, warm and spiced, the kind dragons favored. He didn't know for certain it was true. He'd only read it once in an old book. But every visit, by the time they left, the bowl was completely empty. It had started with a book. Edric kept a modest collection of reading material on the shelf above his personal work table, manuals on leatherwork and hardware, a few histories of regional trade, a worn atlas he had owned since his 20s, and a handful of miscellaneous volumes accumulated over decades of browsing market stalls without particular intention. One of these was a slim, age-softened book titled Customs and Curiosities of the Mountain Peoples, purchased years ago for a single chapter on traditional bag-making techniques from the highland communities north of Velmoor. And he had read the rest of the book eventually, the way he read most things, steadily, without urgency, in the quiet hours after the shop closed. Somewhere in the later chapters, tucked between a passage on dragon territorial habits and a rather dry account of their nesting preferences, was a single paragraph noting that young dragons had a marked fondness for intense warmth in their food. Spiced things, heavily seasoned things, anything carrying concentrated heat that a human tongue would find overwhelming. Cinnamon in particular was mentioned, described as something young dragons responded to the way human children responded to sweetness. Edric had read the paragraph, noted it, and turned the page. He thought of it again 3 days after Smolder, Cinders, and Ash first visited together. He stopped at the confectioner's stall on his way to open the shop and bought a small paper bag of hard cinnamon candies, the strong ones, the kind that made human customers' eyes water slightly. He put them in a ceramic bowl on the corner of his counter without announcement or explanation, positioned where small hands could reach without. He stocked fireproof thread in 3 colors and sourced volcanic-treated leather from a distant supplier. He reorganized his bench so that small repairs always had their own dedicated waiting space. He told himself it was simply smart business. He did not ask himself why he smiled each morning. The thread came first. He had been using a single spool of fireproof thread sourced from a supplier who outfitted blacksmiths and furnace workers. Practical, reliable, but available only in a dull charcoal gray that suited industrial work and nothing much else. It had served perfectly well for the early repairs. But somewhere around the 4th week of regular visits, Edric found himself looking at a finished bag and thinking, with the particular dissatisfaction of a craftsman whose standards had quietly raised themselves without his permission.
Months passed, and the 3 stopped wearing their hoods inside the shop entirely. Edric never flinched at the scales, the ember-bright eyes, or the occasional excited puff of smoke. He simply remembered each of their preferences and quietly adjusted everything without being asked. It happened gradually, the way most important things do. Smolder's hood came down first, not deliberately, not as a decision exactly, but during a moment when she had leaned forward to watch Edric work a particularly stubborn buckle back into alignment, and the hood simply slipped, and she did not put it back up. She sat very still afterward, watching his face with the focused intensity of someone ready to move quickly if necessary. Edric glanced at her, noted the dark iridescent scales along her jaw and temples, the amber eyes with their vertical pupils that caught the lamplight like polished stone, and returned his attention to the buckle without any change in his expression whatsoever. Smolder's shoulders dropped approximately 1 full inch with relief. Cinders followed to visits later, and Ash, always the most cautious, always the one who needed to be certain before committing, came last. On a gray Tuesday morning when the shop was warm and smelled of beeswax and cinnamon, and everything familiar, and the hood simply stayed down and nobody mentioned it, and that was the dot. They were beautiful, in the particular way that young dragons were beautiful, scales and deep jewel tones. Smolder's a dark charcoal that caught blue light at certain angles. Cinder's a warm reddish brown like cooling embers. Ash is the pale silver gray of early morning smoke. Their eyes were extraordinary. Their claws, when relaxed, curved with an elegant economy that Edric found himself appreciating in the same way. He appreciated fine metal work. He noticed all of this the way he noticed everything, carefully, quietly, without making it anyone's business but his own. He remembered that Smolder liked to stand at the workbench and watch the stitching process. So he positioned his lamp to illuminate the work from an angle visible to someone standing at counter height. He remembered that Cinders was easily startled by sudden loud sounds. A drop. Tool once had sent a small alarm burst of flame toward his ceiling, so he moved his heavier implements to a padded section of the bench and made a habit of setting things down gently. He remembered that Ash communicated primarily through gesture and expression, and occasionally through small precise drawings scratched with one claw tip on the paper tags. So he began leaving a notepad and soft pencil on the counter corner closest to where Ash preferred to stand. None of these adjustments were announced. None were commented upon. They were simply there, each morning, waiting, the same way the candy bowl was waiting, the same way the repaired bags were waiting, the same way Edric was always, reliably, waiting. He knew Cinders favored reinforced stitching on the left, and Ash needed smaller buckles for growing claws. He noticed when Smolder was hurting before she ever said a word, because her bags came in newly burned. On those days, he tucked a small bag of cinnamon candies inside the repaired satchel without comment. He had begun keeping a small notebook. Not for billing purposes. His billing system was simple enough to exist entirely in his head, but because he had found, over decades of working with regular customers, that remembering the details of someone's preferences was one of the most honest forms of respect a craftsman could offer. It said, without words, that the person had been worth paying attention to, that they had been seen, Cinder's preference for reinforced left-side stitching had revealed itself gradually. Across several repairs, she carried everything on her right shoulder, always, which meant the left seam bore the full stress of the bag's weight and movement throughout the day. Standard stitching held well enough under normal circumstances, but Cinder's was enthusiastic in her movements, quick turns, sudden stops. The occasional startled leap that Edric had witnessed twice now in his own shop. And standard stitching had proven optimistic under these conditions. He began doubling the left seam on everything he made or repaired for her, then tripling it, until he arrived at a reinforcement level that satisfied his professional conscience entirely. Ash's buckle situation was a matter of simple biology. The claws were growing, visibly, incrementally, the way young creatures grow, when they are finally receiving enough of whatever they had previously gone without. And the standard buckle width that had worked in autumn created genuine difficulty by winter. The claw tips catching on the hardware in a way that was clearly frustrating. Though Ash never complained, Edric began sourcing wider mouth buckles with a smoother interior curve, shaped so that growing claws could pass through cleanly without snagging. He transitioned all of Ash's repairs to this specification without comment, and watched the small, frustrated catches disappear entirely with quiet satisfaction. Smolder was different. Smolder's needs were not mechanical. He learned to read her bags, the way a careful person learns to read weather, by accumulation of small signs that individually meant little, but together told a complete and honest story. When she was well, her bags arrived with the ordinary damage of regular use. When something was wrong, when something had happened that she carried alone and silently the way she carried everything. Difficult, the bags came in newly scorched, the burn patterns deep and fresh and concentrated in the grip areas, where small clawed hands had held on through something hard in the night. On those days, Edric worked with particular gentleness. He repaired every inch of damage with his best materials and his most careful hand. And when the finished bag was folded and ready, he tucked a small paper bag of cinnamon candies into the interior pocket. Never on top where it would be immediately obvious, always inside, where it would be found later, privately. When she was alone, he never mentioned it. She never mentioned it, but the paper bags always came back empty, folded neatly and placed on his counter with the same quiet deliberateness with which Smolder did everything. It was, in its own small way, a conversation. One of the most important ones he had ever had. One autumn morning, Smolder came in alone, carrying a bag that was not broken, but handmade. She had stitched it herself, claws learning slowly, leather uneven, buckle slightly crooked with effort. "I made it," she said quietly, "because I watched you. I wanted to learn." The morning carried the particular quality of late autumn light that Edric had always found the most honest, pale and clear, and without pretension, illuminating everything exactly as it was without the softening warmth of summer or the dramatic contrast of winter. It came through his wavy old window glass and lay itself across his workbench in long quiet rectangles while he sat with his tea and considered the day's work ahead. The bell rang. He looked up expecting the familiar trio and found, instead, only Smolder, standing alone in his doorway with her hood down and her ember eyes carrying an expression he had not seen on her before. Not the wariness of early visits, not the careful watchfulness of a creature assessing safety, but something rawer and more exposed than either. The particular vulnerability of someone who has made something with their own hands and is about to show it to a person whose opinion matters more than they had perhaps intended. She approached the counter slowly. She was not carrying a damaged bag beneath her arm in the usual way. She was holding something against her chest with both hands. And as she reached the counter and set it down carefully between them, Edric saw what it was: a bag, small, roughly rectangular, fashioned from a piece of leather that had been cut with reasonable accuracy, if not perfect precision. The stitching ran along all four seams in uneven but determined lines, the spacing inconsistent, the tension varying from the tight to loose in places. the thread occasionally doubling back where a stitch had clearly been attempted, reconsidered, and attempted again with stubbornness. A small brass buckle sat on the front flap, attached with visible effort, its alignment a few degrees off-center in a way that suggested the installer had known this and decided it was acceptable rather than begin again. It was imperfect in every technical sense that Edric's trained I could identify. He did not see the imperfections first. He saw the hours in it. He saw the patience required to push a needle through stiff leather, with claws not designed for the task. He saw the places where the stitching improved incrementally from one seam to the next. Evidence of a mind paying close attention and adjusting in real time. He saw the decision to attach the buckle anyway, crooked as it was, rather than abandon the whole endeavor, which told him something important about the character of its maker. Smolder's claws rested at the counter's edge. She looked at the bag rather than at him. "I made it," she said quietly. The words came carefully, as though she had considered them for some time before arriving. "Because I watched you. I wanted to learn." The shop was very still around them both. Edric set down his tea, reached across the counter, and picked up the bag with both hands. Edric examined it seriously, the way he examined every single piece that came through his door. "The stitching is tight," he said. "That's the hardest part. You've got good instincts." Then he asked if she wanted to learn how to fix the buckle and picked up his tools. He turned the bag over in his hands slowly, the way he always did, not performing examination, but actually doing it, giving the object his complete and undivided, professional attention with the same focused respect he had given every piece of work that had ever crossed his counter in 40 years of this trade. He checked the stitching first, running his thumb along each seam with light pressure to test the tension and feel for weak points. The spacing was uneven, yes, wider in some places, compressed in others where the maker had clearly been concentrating harder, or finding the angle more difficult. But the thread had been pulled through with genuine consistency of force, which was the element that actually determined a seam's integrity under stress. Uneven spacing could be learned out of a person with practice. Inconsistent tension was harder to correct because it lived in the hands rather than the eyes. Smolder's tension was good, naturally, instinctively good. He checked the leather necks, how the panels had been cut, how they met at the corners, how the edges had been finished. The cuts were slightly irregular but made with conviction, not hesitation. The corners were ambitious. One had been attempted 3 times by the evidence of small additional holes nearby. Before the final version had been committed to, he respected the 3 attempts considerably, more than he would have respected a single perfect corner achieved without difficulty. He examined the buckle last, noting the angle, the rivet placement, the way the flap leather had been prepared to receive it, which had actually been done quite correctly, suggesting the maker had studied this particular step with special attention before attempting it. He set the bag down on the counter between them and looked at Smolder directly. She was watching him with the absolute stillness of someone awaiting a verdict that carried real weight, her ember eyes steady and her claws motionless against the counter's edge, giving nothing away except the faint and telling fact that she was giving nothing away. "The stitching is tight," he said. His voice carried no inflation or false encouragement, simply the calm, even tone of a craftsman delivering an accurate assessment. That's the hardest part to teach and the hardest part to learn. Most people who try this the first time pull too hard or not hard enough, and the seam fails within a week. He turned the bag slightly so the stitching caught the light. "Yours will hold. You've got good instincts." Smolder said nothing, but something behind her eyes shifted, quietly, deeply, the way things shift when a truth arrives that a person has been hoping for without allowing themselves to hope to openly. Edric reached under the counter and produced his rivet tool and a small alignment guide he used for buckle work. "The buckle just needs the rivet. Reposition half a measure to the left," he said. 5 minutes. Do you want to learn how to do it yourself, or would you prefer to watch first? He laid the tools between them on the counter and waited, without pressure, for her answer. Smolder stepped closer. Cinders and Ash slipped in from the doorway where they'd been quietly waiting. The three dragons settled into the small warm shop as naturally as breathing, as simply as belonging. Edric smiled and reached for his tools, still not knowing he had already won their hearts entirely. Smolder's answer was not a word. It was a single step forward, toward the counter, toward the tools, toward him, and it carried in it everything a word would have taken considerably longer to say. The bell above the door rang softly a moment later. Edric did not look up, but he heard the particular shuffle of the familiar sets of small feet crossing his threshold, and the specific quality of silence that followed, the careful, practiced silence of Cinders and Ash doing their very best to enter a room without being noticed, which they had never once successfully managed and which Edric had never once pointed out. He heard Cinders settle onto her usual stool with a small sound of contentment. He heard Ash climb up beside her and reach, with the confidence of long habit, for the notepad on the counter corner. The shop filled in the way it always did when all three were present, not with noise exactly, but with a particular quality of aliveness, a warmth that had nothing to do with the small iron stove in the corner and everything to do with the specific combination of these three presences occupying this specific space. Edric positioned the alignment guide on the buckle flap and handed Smolder the rivet tool, adjusting the angle of the lamp so the work was clearly illuminated. For someone standing at her height, he talked through the process in the same calm, unhurried way. He explained everything, simply, precisely, without condescension, treating her as someone capable of understanding what she was being shown, because he had always found that people generally rose to match the expectations held of them. Smolder listened with her whole self, the way she did everything that mattered to her. Cinders had begun sorting the spare buckles by size along the counter's edge, reorganizing them into the arrangement she had decided upon weeks ago, and quietly maintained ever since. Ash was sketching something in the notepad, small careful lines that Edric would find later and recognize as a drawing of the shop's interior. Remarkably accurate, with three small figures and one tall one gathered around a workbench. Edric looked at none of this directly. He simply knew it was happening. The way he knew the weight of thread on a spool without measuring it. The way he knew the quality of leather by touch in the dark. Through the accumulated intimacy of long and patient attention. He smiled at the buckle work in front of him, at Smolder's claws finding their careful way around the rivet tool with growing confidence, at the ordinary extraordinary miracle of a morning in his shop. He did not know, had no way of knowing, would perhaps never fully know, that the three young dragons who had arrived at his door with nothing but broken bags and the careful wariness of creatures who had learned early that the world did not reliably make space for them. He had become the surest and safest place they knew, that his shop existed in their minds as the one location in Velmore where they were neither strange, nor burdensome, nor required to be anything other than exactly what they were. That his steady, unhurried, unconditional welcome had settled into their hearts over months of cinnamon candies and fireproof thread and fees waived without fuss, and had built there something as strong and carefully constructed as the seams he stitched, something that would hold, without question, under any pressure the world chose to apply. He simply reached for his tools, and taught, and smiled, and was entirely himself, and that, from the very first gray morning, a small scorched satchel had been pushed across his counter by the small clawed hands, had always been more than enough. It had been, without his ever intending it, absolutely everything. The greatest things a person builds are rarely the ones they set out to construct. Sometimes, without a single grand gesture or purposeful act of love, a quiet man with steady hands and an honest heart simply shows up every morning, without fail, and that is how he becomes someone's whole world.